When a person goes missing on a towering kilometer-high mountain or along a winding, treacherous trail, it can take months or sometimes years to uncover even a hint of what happened. Cases like these aren't just heartbreaking. They're surprisingly common. On our channel, we've covered plenty of gripping stories like this, but every so often, incidents occur that are even stranger, where authorities have an immediate witness to the missing person's fate, yet the witness cannot or will not explain what they saw. Back in 1996, two baffling reports of hikers vanishing in the mountains left investigators stunned. In both cases, there was only one witness who knew the entire truth: the trusted dog. What's insane is that these animals experienced something firsthand that would take years for investigators to piece together, and even then, the full picture would remain disturbingly out of reach. This is the compilation of those untold stories. On the morning of August 10th, 1996, a woman living in the small California town of Modesto walked into her kitchen, ready to start her usual routine, when she came across a note sitting on the counter. As she read it, she realized it was from her son, Michael Madden, who had mentioned that he was heading out on a camping trip with his dog, Matilda, to a campground called Sandbar Flat, along the Stanislaus River, southeast of Sacramento, about 2.5-hour drive from their house. While it came out of nowhere, this was not the first time something like this had happened. Michael was 20 years old, and for most of his life he had been somewhat of a loner. He did not have friends and enjoyed being around his close family, but growing up in a broken household where his parents had divorced and his father had been a constant source of trouble, Michael had turned to the outdoors to find some peace. Whether it was camping, fishing, or hiking, everyone in his circle knew him for his passion for adventure. He loved nature so much that he was studying wildlife biology at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California, with plans to eventually become a U.S. Forest Service ranger. Because of that, these spur-of-the-moment trips were nothing new. He'd disappear for a bit, then his family would piece together where he'd gone before he'd eventually come back. However, he was always responsible about leaving word of where he was going, just like he did this time. Sandbar Flat Campground was, and still is, one of the most popular and easy to access camping spots in the region, and for Michael, it might as well have been his backyard. Despite the rocky relationship with his father, one of the few good memories they shared came from time spent camping at that very spot. Even as an adult, whenever Michael felt the pull of nostalgia or just needing to clear his head, that campground was where he went. The morning of August 10th was no different. After leaving a note for his mother, Michael packed up his Chevy Cavalier with his camping and fishing gear, grabbed Matilda, and drove out into the wilderness. This time, though, he would never come back. For 2 days straight, from early morning on August 10th to late at night on August 12th, Michael was completely on his own, with pretty much no contact with anyone. Then late on the night of August 12th, a group of his friends made a last-minute plan to head out and watch a meteor shower in a nearby town. On the way, they realized they would be passing right by the campsite Michael was supposed to be at, so they figured, why not swing through and surprise him, especially since they knew he was out traveling too. The group of 4, 2 girls and 2 guys, one of them Michael's close childhood friend, Manuel Ferreira, made their way down the rough, bumpy road towards the campsite just before 2 a.m. From a distance, they could see a campfire still burning a few yards away. Fired up and excited, they hopped out the car, thinking Michael had to be right there. They walked in, laughing and talking, already imagining how shocked he'd be to see them show up at that hour. But once they reached the campsite, their carefree, excited surprise suddenly turned into something very creepy. To this day, almost 29 years later, what happened next is still a mess of conflicting stories. The events of that night and the next few days have been told in different ways by the people who were there and by others who showed up later. No one can fully agree on how it all went down or who is being completely straight about it. The best we can do is piece things together using what overlaps in most of the accounts, then circle back to the parts where these stories start to split. The four friends found the campsite clean and perfectly set up, but when they looked around, Michael was nowhere to be found, and there was no sign of Matilda either. What made it even stranger was that the camp was wide open, and the fire still had fresh wood burning in it. It looked like someone had been there just moments earlier, and as it turns out, someone had. Not long after, a tall, strange man came out of the darkness, holding a .45 automatic pistol, acting jumpy and all over the place. He pointed the gun at them and started demanding to know who they were and what they were doing there. The group tried to slow him down, telling him they were friends of Michael and had come to meet him, to which he pointed down a trail leading away from the campsite and said Michael had taken off that way. Once things settled a little, Michael's friend Manuel tried to break the ice by reaching out to shake the guy's hand, but he turned it down. Eventually, the man said his name was Joseph Tyne and claimed he got spooked because Michael never told him anyone else was coming. When asked how he knew Michael, Joseph said they had run into each other at the campsite and just made small talk here and there, borrowing sodas and ice like random campers usually do. On its own, that could have made some sense. But by this point, the group couldn't ignore the fact that he kept calling Michael Mikey, a nickname Michael never used. That, however, wasn't the worst part of this whole encounter. As the group stuck around waiting for Michael to show up, Joseph kept rambling about some three-eyed creature he claimed he had shot behind the camp, and he didn't stop there. The whole time he kept cocking his gun, muttering to himself and talking to the bushes. This went on from around midnight all the way into the morning for about 6 hours. After that, they reported Michael missing and left the situation in the hands of the authorities. The next morning, cops swept through the campsite, followed the trail Joseph had pointed out, but nothing came of it. Over the next couple of days, investigators interviewed Michael's close friends and family, trying to find any clue that could explain his disappearance, but that also went nowhere. Then on the 4th day of the search, Michael's dog Matilda suddenly wandered back into the campsite, clearly exhausted and dehydrated. What stood out though was that she hadn't lost a single pound and had no injuries or damage to her paws, despite being out in the Rocky Mountains for days on her own. That suggested she had been well fed during that time, which made it seem like Michael's disappearance wasn't random at all. This suspicion could have been cleared up pretty easily if authorities had checked Matilda's stomach, but for whatever reason, they never did, despite repeated requests from Michael's family and friends. To make things worse, the search for Michael was called off the very same day Matilda came back, after checking just one trail. Apparently, Matilda was used to track the scent back to Michael partway through and was too exhausted to keep going. Normally, that's when police hounds get brought in to pick up where the trail goes cold, but that never happened here either. On top of everything, Michael's family later said the campsite and his car were never properly secured. Everything was basically left out in the open once the officers left for the night, making it too easy for evidence to be tampered with. The kind of sloppy handling was one thing that seriously affected the investigation. The other was just how different the stories about that night and the days after were, depending on who you asked. For example, Michael's friend Manuel, who got closest to Joseph Tyne that night and tried to shake his hand, later explained what he saw in more detail. According to Manuel, when they arrived at the campsite, apparently startled Joseph, he appeared to be under the influence of some kind of drugs, which would explain the strange claims about shooting a three-eyed creature and talking to himself all night. Not just that, Manuel spotted some things around the campsite that made him think Joseph wasn't just high. He might have been cooking meth. Apparently, there was a car battery rigged up to power the camp light and a screen set up like a makeshift workstation. During their short conversation, Joseph also mentioned breaking down phosphorus from road flares, which was a common step in meth production at the time. Manuel recognized this because his own brother had been in prison for cooking meth, and it led him to form a theory about what might have happened to Michael. According to him, Michael cared deeply about nature, and if he had stumbled onto Joseph running a meth operation, he would have confronted him, which could have led Joseph to abduct him, or worse, kill him to keep it quiet. Manuel backs this up by saying Joseph acted way too comfortable using Michael's stuff that night. He was eating his food, drinking his sodas, burning his firewood, like he knew Michael wasn't coming back. On top of that, Manuel and the others noticed Joseph was wearing Michael's hiking boots, or at least a very similar pair, which felt like way more than just a coincidence. Then there's the final detail. After Michael was reported missing, the next morning Joseph vanished from the campsite for 5 days and only reappeared once the search was officially called off. Because of all of this, most of Michael's friends, especially the 4 who were there that night, were convinced Joseph Tyne was responsible for his disappearance. However, not everyone saw things that way. Michael's half-brother, Randy Powell, had almost the complete opposite take. According to Randy, Joseph Tyne was innocent and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Randy says Joseph actually cooperated throughout the investigation and had a solid, consistent story that made sense. In contrast, Randy believed it was actually Michael's friends who were more suspicious. They waited 6 hours before reporting Michael missing and didn't fully explain what happened that night to the police until about a week later. In Randy's eyes, that gave them plenty of time to get their stories straight. Randy also accused the group of leaving the park after reporting Michael missing to a ranger, then coming back late that night after investigators had gone and breaking into Michael's car, which again hadn't been properly secured by police. Of course, Randy couldn't prove any of this, just like Manuel couldn't prove his claims about Joseph. In the end, it was one side's word against the other. Interestingly enough, while all the blame was being tossed back and forth between Joseph and Michael's friends, neither of them was actually the early suspect. It was Michael's own father, Larry Madden. As mentioned earlier, Michael had a complicated relationship with him, but it wasn't just the family tension. Larry was a repeat offender with a record for petty theft and burglary, and he'd been battling drug addiction pretty much his whole life. That alone would have been enough to put him on the radar right away, but there was another detail that raised even more questions. While Michael was still young, Larry had reportedly taken out a life insurance policy on him, naming himself as the beneficiary. Once that became known, people close to the family couldn't help but wonder whether that money gave Larry a motive to be involved in Michael's disappearance. However, when investigators looked into it, Larry produced an alibi that placed him in Oregon at the time Michael disappeared. He also passed a polygraph test, which cleared him as a suspect, at least officially, and took him off the investigation. The cops also looked into the possibility that Michael might have taken his own life or fallen victim to a wild animal. But again, neither of those angles could be proven. There's also been a long-standing belief in investigative circles that Michael may have crossed paths with an unknown serial killer, possibly someone like Cary Stayner, who was active in that region around the same time. In 2016, human remains were also found near the same campsite, but those couldn't be connected to Michael, and just like so much else in this case, it turned out to be another dead end, and another speculation with no proof. Speaking of which though, to this day the most talked about and seemingly most plausible theory still revolves around Joseph Tyne. Around 9 months after Michael went missing, Joseph Tyne was finally given a polygraph test after repeated requests from Manuel and other friends of Michael. Not only did he pass the test, but the gun he was accused of cocking throughout that entire night was also found with no spent shells in it. But according to Manuel, that doesn't really clear Joseph the way people think it does. He believes there's a real chance Joseph beat the polygraph, pointing out that lie detector tests have plenty of limitations and are known to produce false results. Not only that, ever since the day Michael vanished, Joseph has reportedly been arrested multiple times on drug-related charges. To Manuel, that only adds weight to his meth cooking theory that day. There's also another rumor that Michael was involved with a girl who had an extremely possessive boyfriend. The idea is that the boyfriend might have had someone kill Michael to get him out of the picture. On the surface, it sounds very high school and dramatic, but there's one detail that makes this one sound plausible. That possessive boyfriend reportedly grew up in the same neighborhood as none other than Joseph Tyne himself, which can only make you wonder if Joseph was acting on his behalf. A few years after the incident, a neighbor of Michael's ran into Joseph Tyne and asked him if he knew anything about Michael or the Sandbar Flat campground. Joseph denied ever hearing the name, which makes his behavior even more suspicious. To this day, Michael Madden's disappearance remains a haunting mystery, with no real end in sight. But when you look back there are two things that could have made a real difference in the investigation: the boots Joseph was accused of wearing, and Michael's dog, Matilda. If those boots had been taken for DNA testing, it could have been determined whether they actually belonged to Michael or not. But DNA technology was extremely limited at the time, and on top of that, the overall handling of the case was of course a mess. The other major factor was Matilda. She almost certainly knew what happened to Michael, but she couldn't lead investigators back to him due to sheer exhaustion. If search dogs had been deployed, or if Matilda had been given another chance to track, or even if her stomach had been examined, things might have turned out very differently. According to reports, Michael's now late mother grieved the loss of her son for the rest of her life, carrying that pain with her until her final days. The summer of 1996 was supposed to be the first time life would finally make sense for 26-year-old Laura Winans. Born into a wealthy family, she had always been a troubled child, struggling with behavioral issues as well as a deep sense of not fitting in. Throughout her life as an adult, she battled alcohol addiction and eventually dropped out of college, feeling like an outsider both on campus and inside her own home. This self-destructive behavior, though, wasn't just out of nowhere. Laura had been repeatedly sexually abused by a trusted adult during her childhood, and no matter how hard she tried to explain that pain through her actions, her family never truly understood it. That trauma shaped how she saw herself and pushed her to question her sexuality from a young age. So when she finally broke away from her family, she made the decision to come out and live life on her own terms. That freedom, however, didn't come easy. Dropping out of college meant working multiple jobs, juggling therapy, and slowly trying to rebuild her mental health while finding her way back into school. But things began to change in 1994 when Laura joined the nonprofit organization Woods Women as an intern. There, she trained in outdoor skills like rock climbing, canoeing, hiking, and leadership, eventually working towards becoming a guide herself. Woods Women was a woman-run outdoor adventure and education program based in Minnesota from 1977 to 1999, serving more than 8,000 women and 12,000 children, many of whom were survivors of abuse, people working through trauma, and members of the LGBTQ community. It was there, leading canoe trips, hiking through the rugged wilderness, and sharing demanding outdoor adventures with people just like her, that Laura finally began to find a sense of peace and belonging. But that wasn't the only reason. During her training, Laura met a passionate geologist from St. Cloud named Juliana Williams, or Julie, as she liked to call herself, and felt a spark almost right away. Like Laura, Julie was struggling with her sexuality too, trying to figure out how to keep her identity and her Christian faith from tearing each other apart. She hadn't told her family back home either, and had settled in Vermont so she could work through all of that without being surrounded by people from her past. Laura eventually ended up being the person who helped Julie truly embrace herself. They still kept things private, but the two started dating and grew close fast. For the next 2 years, they managed their lives in different cities, balancing personal struggles, long-distance drives while visiting each other, and their shared love for the outdoors whenever they could escape together. Then in May of 1996, they finally caught a break. The couple found a perfect little house overlooking a ravine in the small town of Huntington in Vermont, sitting right in the Green Mountains of the Appalachian Range. Julie had landed a job there too, and everything was finally falling into place. But before settling into the new life, they wanted to celebrate the first real sense of relief they'd had in years. So they decided to do the exact thing that brought them together in the first place. It was a 10-day backpacking trip through Shenandoah National Park, running along Virginia's famous Blue Ridge Mountains. Shenandoah National Park stretches over 200,000 acres of rolling hills, dense forests, and scenic valleys, offering everything from hiking and wildlife sightings to backcountry camping grounds, hidden waterfalls, and panoramic backdrops that stretch for miles. The park is also famous for a massive 170 kilometers highway called Skyline Drive, which cuts all the way through it, featuring sweeping views into the Shenandoah Valley on one side and rolling Blue Ridge peaks on the other, with overlook after overlook pulling drivers deeper into the landscape. On Sunday, May 19, 1996, Julie and Laura pitched their tent about half a kilometer off and down the Skyline Drive on one of the park's horse trails next to a small, scenic mountain stream. Accompanying them was the third member of their family, Laura's golden retriever, Taj. Right after setting up camp, the three of them grabbed their camera gear and headed straight for White Oak Canyon Trail. Stretching nearly 15 kilometers, this route came with a punishing climb of more than 700 meters, winding them deeper into the park. Along the way, they passed massive moss-covered boulders and towering hemlocks that had stood for nearly 400 years. Small trickles of water followed them downhill, quietly merging into fast-moving streams, until the trail finally sent them down into deep gorges as full-blown waterfalls. But then the weather turned nasty. Heavy rain kept them stuck at camp for the next 2 days. Once things finally cleared up, they headed out again, this time aiming for Hawksbill Mountain, which is the highest peak in the park at around 1,200 meters. Around this time, on May 24th, they renewed their permit and caught a free lift from a park ranger, which turned out to be the last time anyone saw them in person. Photos on their camera later showed they did make it back to their campsite near Skyline Drive that night, but that's where the photo trail suddenly stops. On May 31st, their 10-day getaway had already stretched into day 13, and when they still hadn't come back, Julie's roommate got worried and called her dad, who immediately reported them both missing. Park rangers started checking their last known whereabouts and tracked down their car with their belongings still inside, untouched. While they couldn't locate the women right away, they did find the dog Taj wandering through the park with no leash. The search dragged on for another 24 hours. Then on the evening of June 1st, 1996, the same day Julie was supposed to start her new job, park rangers finally located Julie and Laura's campsite, and what they walked into was straight out of a nightmare. Laura was inside her tent, and Julie was about 10 to 12 meters away, wrapped up in her sleeping bag. Both women were dead. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Their hands were tied, their mouths gagged, and they were partially undressed. And worst of all, their throats had been slit so deeply they were nearly decapitated. What makes this even crazier is the location. The campsite was only about half a kilometer from the park's main highway, and less than a kilometer from Skyland lodges, which were packed since it was the weekend right after Memorial Day, and yet no one heard a thing. No screams, no struggle, no one saw anyone coming or going. Once again, the only witness was the golden retriever Taj, but with the bodies already found and no suspect to identify, the dog was of no use. For several months, the National Park Service teamed up with the FBI to hunt down the killer, gathering around 15,000 leads, but nothing really panned out. Because of Laura and Julie's sexuality and the brutal way they were killed, the incident was assumed to be a hate crime against women and the LGBTQ community. Investigators even tried linking it to other similar murders, but there wasn't any solid proof. It wasn't until a year later when the first and what would turn out to be the main suspect in the case for over 20 years finally showed up. In June of 1997, a Maryland branch of an IT company, MCI System House in Columbia, fired an employee in his late 20s named Daryl David Rice for being hostile at work. His coworkers said he'd constantly yell sexual curses at them, steal their lunches, purposely bump into them to spill coffee, and was even reported punching a hole in the men's bathroom wall and taking down a woman's picture and throwing it in the trash. At the time, no charges were pushed against him, but just a month later, things got even worse. A Canadian woman was out on a bike ride along the same Skyline Drive when a truck came at her violently, shoving her off the road and her bike. The driver screamed sexual profanities at her, got out and tried to drag her into the vehicle. She managed to fight him off, so he jumped back in the truck and tried to run her over multiple times while she ducked behind a tree. Eventually, the guy took off, but rangers caught him as he was trying to escape the park. When they searched his vehicle, they found hand and leg restraints inside, proving that he was trying to kidnap her. As you can tell, that driver was the same Daryl David Rice. Daryl was sentenced to 135 months in prison for attempted abduction, but pretty soon the investigators noticed his timeline put him in the same area a year earlier as well, right around when Laura and Julie went missing. On top of that, during his interview, Daryl made a lot of hate-filled statements about women, in particular those within the LGBTQ community, which lined up way too closely with the way the case was looking back then. But since he flat out denied being involved in the murders, all the authorities really had to go on were timelines. Daryl's DNA was tested against the evidence from the crime scene multiple times, but it never came up with anything. From 1997 all the way to 2024, investigators worked to build a case against him. Meanwhile, Daryl got out of jail after serving his sentence and went back to living his life. Though the authorities kept tabs on him, nothing really connected him to the crimes except for his aggressive behavior toward women and the LGBTQ community. Then in early 2024, Daryl David died in a car accident. It was at that moment, when the case was about to go cold, that the FBI finally revealed the killer's name on June 20th, 2024. According to the report, the long-standing DNA evidence collected from the crime scene matched another serial rapist, Walter Leo Jackson, with a mind-blowing 2.6 trillion to 1 ratio. Walter, who worked as a residential painter, was also an avid outdoorsman who often visited Shenandoah National Park. He was later charged in multiple cases of kidnapping, rape, and assault. While the FBI is still digging into exactly what Walter did in connection with the murders, he had already died in 2018 while serving time for other crimes, leaving those to realize that justice may never be reached.